Hello, I'm Barry Daniel, and this is the podcast of the Middle Way Society. Our aim is to encourage a universal approach to living a more integrated, ethical life, avoiding dogma or any absolute appeal to authority. We welcome back to the podcast Igor Grossmann, who is an Associate Professor of Psychology and the Director of the Wisdom and Research Lab based at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. His main research interest is the complex processes that enable individuals to think and act wisely. He's also done pioneering work on the development of wisdom in different cultures, and he was named one of the 2015 Rising Stars in the field of psychological science. He's going to be joined today in discussion with a regular guest on the podcast, the philosopher Robert M Ellis, who is the chair of the Middle Way Society and author, amongst other books, of the Middle Way Philosophy series. Igor has recently published a paper in Perspectives on Psychological Science entitled Wisdom in Context, in which he puts forward four main factors that foster wise thinking, and this is going to be the topic of our discussion today. Hello, Igor and Robert. Nice to have you back on the podcast.
Nice to having me. Hello.
Hello.
Okay, well, maybe we could start just with this idea of wisdom in context. One of the main points you make, Igor, is that we don't have to idealize wisdom. We don't have to put it on a pedestal. It's not a trait that a privileged or learned few have, but it's an ability that we all have to varying degrees, depending very much on the context, and also one that can be cultivated.
Yes, so the research that we have done, as well as some others recently, seems to suggest that wisdom is more of a skill. It's not an essence that you either have it or you don't have it. And it varies dramatically from one situation to the next. So what we sometimes miss when we think about wisdom is that it's not just a property of wise people, but it's at least as much a property of the situations that people happen to be in.
Okay, what are your thoughts on that, Robert?
Well, I'd be interested to know more about that. So how is it a property of the situations rather than of the person, do you think?
In social psychology in general, we quite often think about the such things as reasoning or thinking or emotion regulation, at least as much as influenced by the situation. So it's like the person may not necessarily enact the reasoning principles that would be associated with wisdom or regulate the emotions in the same way, depending on what situation they're in. So it's sort of like the situation is calling for various aspects of wisdom. So, for instance, if you're thinking about meeting other people, when you meet other people, you right away start to engage in sort of like a perspective take. Instead of start to think about their perspectives. This may not necessarily happen automatically when you are just sitting by yourself in a room without anybody around you. So this is just like a very silly example, but what it demonstrates is that many of the things and the sort of skills that we have, they only unfold in the interaction between the person and the context that they're in.
Okay, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, I'm used to discussing wisdom, for example, in the Aristotelian context as a virtue, and a virtue is a kind of disposition, but a disposition is only going to appear in certain contexts, isn't it, when certain things stimulate it. Presumably that fits what you were saying.
Right, and I mean, from the Aristotelian perspective, quite often this idea of disposition is often caricatured. So, for instance, the way how Aristotle certainly talked about disposition is very different from, as some would say, the only interpretation, at least unless you read ancient Greek, but it's very different from the lay concept of disposition that is currently prevalent. So we have to be very careful when we, for instance, take this concept, and in the lay concept of disposition, it's quite often without the context. It's really just like the stable property of a person, whereas, of course, for Aristotle, it was somewhat different.
Okay. I mean, I'd be interested to hear more about your framework, what the evidence you've found for these 4 points of wisdom.
Well, the 4 points that I've put forward really often as an example of what various philosophical traditions, but mainly psychological traditions, behavioral science traditions of wisdom have come about recently, concern the notion of sort of humility, intellectual humility in particular, recognizing that your knowledge is limited, so to say almost like Socratean wisdom, like knowing that I don't know much, if you want to interpret it that way. Then the appreciation of different perspectives on an issue that you may have at hand is quite often associated with wisdom. The notion of sort of dialecticism or change in social events over time, how things may unfold, and there are multiple ways how things may unfold, not just like one rule of thumb. And one further component that I highlighted in the figure in the paper concerns the integration of different perspectives, or sort of a compromise between them. Now, these are not exclusive characteristics. There are certainly others. For instance, in our work, we also consider an outsider's viewpoint as a cognitive mechanism that sort of pushes these different components in one direction, and whereas if you take sort of an egocentric viewpoint, you often are pushed in the opposite direction, sort of more foolish direction. But what we find empirically, and that's quite remarkable, is that these components, even though they're fairly heterogeneous, tend to cohere together. If the one person is showing one, he or she also tends to show other features. Then these features also vary from one situation to the next. For instance, if you give a person a diary and ask him to fill out a diary for the duration of, let's say, a week, reporting the most difficult thing that happens to them on the day, and then score them based on their reasoning, like they could report, for instance, to what extent they recognize their knowledge and consider change and compromise and so on. And what we find is that there is quite dramatic variability from one situation to the next. In fact, there is more variability within the same person across different situations he or she may encounter, as compared to variability between people on average. So that's quite fascinating. It suggests that we miss quite often this kind of the context. We miss the elephant in the room, which is the power of the situation for these aspects of reasoning. And finally, one thing that we have done is sort of started pioneer, I would say, is rigorous experiments in the lab, as well as field experiments where we use the properties of random assignment, assign people to different conditions, manipulate contexts, or ask them to engage in different forms of instructions, and then see how they work through difficult social conflicts, societal conflicts, or interpersonal conflicts. And what we found is that, for instance, if you think about conflicts of a friend, such as infidelity or trust betrayal, this type of situations, then you're much more likely to engage in these forms of reasoning than when you are just thinking about yourself being involved in the conflict. I also find that when you sort of take a third-person perspective, this kind of observer perspective that I already mentioned earlier, that seems to help you, even when you think about the self, because then you kind of get to the level of reasoning as if you were reasoning about a friend. So this is just like a simple set of experiments, but what it again demonstrates is the power of the situation for wisdom, the power of the context, and how much it is not just inside of you, but in the interaction between you and the environment you're in.
Okay, I mean, seems to offer a fascinating set of possibilities that you can find it. Empirical evidence for these things that have been discussed for so long in so many different ways philosophically, and that's what seems exciting about your work. But obviously there's a potential issue which I discussed a little bit with you, or started to discuss with you on social media, which is how this relates to ethics. So for me, all those kinds of aspects of wisdom that you talk about, so the humility and the appreciation of different perspectives, so provisionality perhaps is the word I tend to use there, and the what you call sensitivity to the possibility of change and integration of different opinions. I mean, all of these are ethical qualities, and we already talked about Aristotle, who was discussing them in the context of his ethics. So for me, it's important that we recognise that this is this is value charged material that is important to us because it has ethical value in a way. Certainly, that's the reason why it's important to me, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, there are two ways to think about it. One is to try to separate it. So sort of a reductionist approach that psychologists have to take in order to study, empirical concepts in the lab or in everyday life, and to quantify them. And there, I think one could go about separating the notion of sort of values or virtues in the ethical domain, just as a light ideas that are sort of like guiding you, from the actual process of engaging in this forms of reasoning, if you want, or judgment. So that this type of separation as a first step can be very fruitful, because then you can try to understand, well, on the one hand, what are the values systems? What are the belief systems that you adhere to? And compare it to what are the ways you reason about the situation. Maybe then, as the next step, you can integrate them together. So what is the intersection between your belief systems, between, to some extent, cultural or ethical belief systems, and the way you reason? How does one influence another? So far, we don't have much empirical evidence about that. That's mainly theoretical. So I started with this first approach. We're looking just at the facets of reasoning, but of course, the notion of ethics, as prevalent in some of the Aristotelian writing, as well as many others, is very important. And quite often when we think about wisdom, we also think about virtues. We think about ideals so that are guiding us, that are sort of providing some kind of a meaning system to us. Now, the other way to think about it is that, of course, they're all sort of from the beginning interrelated, and that you cannot really separate one from another. I find it difficult from an empirical standpoint to start there, even though I hope at the end to end up at the intersection, of course, of, say, this kind of system where you have ideals and you have reasoning and you have some intuitive affective process, if you want. So to get sort of different levels of analysis all integrated together. But for me, it's very important to pay attention to what you are trying to examine statistically, empirically, but also theoretically. And I think it's very important not to confuse and to lay same ground, common ground about what are we talking about. For instance, if we talk about ethics, are we talking about the reasoning components when you're dealing with ethical situation, or are we talking about the ideals that are culturally ingrained and are guiding your thinking, and the culture transmits a sense of ideals? Those are somewhat different things. Of course, they're related. But just conflating the two is probably not the right approach for an empirical scientist like myself. So that would be probably my answer to this question.
I think that idea of common ground is very important. And for me, common ground is obviously based on experience of what human beings tend to have in common that emerges from their embodied circumstances, which presumably your research could tell us a lot about. So what I would mean by ethics wouldn't start with ideals. That would be, the whole approach of the middle way is to avoid that kind of idealization, or that absolutization of a particular a priori starting point, and then you can deduce from that. What we're trying to do in middle way philosophy is beginning with experience and avoiding those absolutes, so as to find the common ground, the integrative common ground that we can work from. But it also seems to be important to recognise that there are values involved in finding and developing that common ground, whether you're working in a more philosophical way or whether you're working in the context of science, because surely scientists, empirical scientists, have values too, don't they? Don't you think it's important to do your research, for example? You value wisdom in the context of your research?
Yeah, I agree. The debate about, of course, the degree to which values of scientists should be influencing the direction or the method of science is a tricky issue. And I think you and I discussed it also on Facebook, because on the one hand, of course, as we start from a particular theoretical position, we are embedded in a particular framework. We're like fish swimming in the water. I mean, if you get suddenly out of the water, you wouldn't be able to swim. At the same time, I think a lot of behavioral scientists and social scientists, as well as physical scientists, biological scientists, try to go to some extent against the implicit biases that are often associated with the ideologies that they may bring with themselves. Just to give you an example, the Royal Society in the UK, one of their mandates right now for the journal is to be aware of the biases that may be guiding the evaluation. What is a good manuscript? What is a good finding? What is a bad finding? Well, they do it because there is quite a bit of research showing that biases, even on the implicit level, can distort our perception of science. So what I'm trying to say is that there is an awareness, of course, of scientists, and to some extent work, a conscious work against some forms of influence of ideology on ourselves. But we are not free of ideology. And I think maybe to take sort of more of a middle way approach to this, it would be sort of appreciating that you have, of course, this embeddedness in a particular sociocultural, ideological context, but at the same time, use it in moderation, instead of just be blind to the fact that you have an ideological position that you start from. Be aware of it, and be aware that there are others and that they may disagree with yours.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, that's what enables us to be provisional and to modify our positions by being aware of alternative perspectives. And I mean, that seems to be very much involved in some of your points about the nature of wisdom, that you talk about the appreciation perspectives broader than the issue at hand.
Right.
I mean, can you say more about how that specifically came about in your research and what you found out about it?
It started theoretically by looking at different positions on what behavioral scientists have conceptualized as wisdom, and this component came to some extent from the tradition in developmental psychology in the 1980s, where people talked about sort of post-formal stages of development, sort of things that adults may be developing in terms of their reasoning beyond just, young adulthood, beyond being a teenager. There's many of the theories before that assume that your development, cognitive development, stops in your late teens, and then it just declines. So, that doesn't seem to be right, because there are a lot of social problems in the world that people may be encountering when they get a bit older. In fact, in your teens, you probably don't encounter that many, or at least relatively speaking, as many problems as when you're a bit older, when you have to when you have to navigate, for instance, family and job, when you have to make certain sacrifices, when you have elderly parents, and so on. And so this idea of appreciation of perspectives broader than the issue at hand is quite central to this notion of relativistic or dialectical thinking, sort of being able to take different perspectives and recognize them, and as the first step. And then, of course, there's a notion of integration, as some of this more, I would say, Marxist-influenced scientists in the 80s wrote, synthesis, or Hegelian if you want, synthesis of different possibly opposing perspectives on an issue. So that's how it came about theoretically. And empirically, it seems to, as I said, it coheres with other components and is quite flexible from one station to the next.
just to make some connections here with other things that interest me. Have you come across Nassim Nicholas Taleb and his ideas about optionality?
I came across, but I didn't have much time yet thinking about it. Can you tell me a bit more?
Well, particularly his idea, I think that's important, is that we are able to think about alternatives. We're able to appreciate different perspectives because we have different options. And that idea of options is something, well, you can think about it perhaps in a more basic sort of biological evolutionary context, that some sort of organism has different evolutionary options. But you can also think of it, obviously, in terms of human choice, that we have different possible ways we could go. And it's because we have options that we're capable of provisionality. So the way I understand this is that, well, if we're going to understand wisdom, then provisionality has got to be a key aspect of wisdom, and optionality seems to be an important aspect of provisionality, that it's not just a question of knowing that there might be alternatives to the view we have at the moment, but also actually being able to imagine alternatives, to have them accessible to us, maybe to have at least some weak synaptic links available to us so that we could possibly go down that way of thinking.
Right. I mean, this is very... I mean, I didn't start thinking about that until later. I mean, I already had sort of what behavioral scientists and to some extent philosophers that I very briefly skipped through talked about, and then later realized that there is quite a bit of convergence with other conceptualizations. I mean, what you talk about, for instance, is also very much consistent with the idea of being able to, sort of the idea of evolutionary advantage of being able to plan for the future and have different plan for different alternatives of what may happen. And sort of like that some philosophers, for instance, Peter Rielton in the U.S., suggest that, well, that sort of is critical maybe for human survival, that we evolved and were able to survive because we were able to plan. So those who were able to plan better and had more maybe diverse and maybe more accurate forecasts about what will happen next and the planning ahead, they had an evolutionary advantage. So to some extent, it maybe is very much ingrained in us to be able to think for the future, to be able to consider multiple perspectives on how things may unfold. Yeah, I did not encounter that until later, even though I have to admit, to my shame, Peter was on my dissertation committee. But this work is only something that started to resonate with me sometime later. It took me a while to get to it.
Right.
But yeah, there is quite a bit of convergence in these different philosophical traditions. It's like in how you conceptualize it in the Middle Way Society, as well as writings of several others on these forms of thinking that to some extent may have an evolutionary advantage, and to some extent maybe promote a society that would be advantageous, that would be more robust and resilient for survival. So it's more of a cultural evolutionary process.
I mean, to use a sort of down-to-earth image, you could talk about having tools in our toolbox. You know, that if we have a variety of tools in our toolbox, then we're able to deal with different kinds of tasks. Presumably, you could understand that in neural terms. That if we've got different possible links, different ways we could think, then we're able to engage in different circumstances, unexpected circumstances, in new ways. But of course, the converse of that is we can get stuck in particular ways of doing things. So, and that's maybe an interesting question to ask you. So, what's the opposite of wisdom?
Well, some people think about it as foolishness, but then again, what exactly is foolishness? So, Robert Sternberg wrote quite a bit about that. I think the commonality or the antagonistic commonality would be rigidity. Rigidity in your thinking, rigidity in your thinking about outcomes. So having one rule of thumb, like this is it. Rigidity in your attitudes towards other people, beliefs about them. Lack of, so overconfidence, sort of instead of intellectual humility. And a refusal to compromise. So inability to to be able to integrate. I mean, sometimes, and I'm not saying compromise in your actions. I mean, that's quite often there's this idea that, you're saying compromise, but what if the other opinion is just atrocious from your ethical standpoint, so there is no way you can integrate it? Well, I'm talking about reasoning. I'm not talking about outcomes. And for reasoning, an integration can also take a form of at least considering it and considering how you react to it when you communicate with the other side. It doesn't mean that you necessarily will endorse that other side in your actions. That's a different story. Yeah, so anyway, so I think those are that would be the components. And I think the commonality of these different antagonistic features is indeed some form of rigidity.
Right, okay. I mean, that's what I've tended to talk about in terms of absolutization, or even metaphysics, perhaps in my early work, but that's liable to be misunderstood. But absolutization is probably a more comprehensible term. But, I mean, is that something you can make sense of calling it that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's quite a number of parallels. And as I said, like, there are parallels to my work, there are parallels to Bob Sternberg's work, theoretical work. And in fact, we have now very recently, so for a new large-scale study that we hopefully will publish this year, preprint is already available online, on wisdom, bias, and balance. We have recently observed that if your reason is this kind of wise fashion as defined by these characteristics of humility and so on, you are more likely to balance, to be less absolute in your terms. Balance your goals. Do you want to influence other people, or do you want to adjust yourself to the situation? Balance your inferences that you're making about the world. Who is responsible for that situation? Is that person, or is that person? Or is it me? Or is it the situation itself that maybe is driving the person's behavior? So it's sort of like balancing these different features. And it's quite fascinating. It's a very strong effect, very reliable effect, both in the UK and in the US. We have seen it so far. And so I think that provides some empirical support to some of the claims about the negative relationship to this kind of rigidity, disbalance, or, in your language, absolutization.
Okay, so you'd agree, would you, that the problematic aspect of bias, or perhaps the bit we can do something about, is related to rigidity?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the way we can work with biases in practice is going to be related to loosening up those rigidities or gaining more provisionality in relation to them.
I mean, I'm not using those terms, of course, because terms vary, but I think we are in pretty much full agreement there that this type of forms of these principles can guide you in the opposite direction from being this kind of absolutely one opinion, very rigid type of person.
Okay. Perhaps I can ask you about another of your 4 points. So you talk about the compromise or integration of different opinions. Mm-hmm. So again, integration is a word I've found very valuable,
right.
And particularly I associate that with Jung and with the kind of framework of Jungian thinking. But obviously you're perhaps thinking about it in a wider way. So can you say more about how you understand that and what sort of evidence you've found for the role of integration in wisdom?
Well, the role of integration in wisdom, again, this is more of a theoretical point, as it is quite often the commonality. In fact, if I were to pick among various definitions that exist currently in behavioral sciences and social sciences about wisdom, this notion of integration is probably the most central one, the most common one across them. And again, that may have historical reasons because, as I said, this behavioral science of wisdom emerged from the earlier developmental work on adult development. And their integration or synthesis was the hallmark of that type of development. So it's not a surprise that it now pops up in all sorts of definitions of wisdom. But I think in terms of practical and empirical insights, what we see is that, well, for instance, one thing that I found quite fascinating recently is that people are quite able to integrate on their own if they are put in certain contexts again. So again, going back to the notion of context. For instance, if you put the person in the position of explaining things to somebody, to a teenager, to an adolescent, explaining a complex political issue. Well, one could think, what would the person do that was trying to explain it to somebody? Well, on the one hand, he may try to convince that person. For instance, imagine this is a time right before Brexit. So the person would say, well, to take one particular position, try to explain why that position is right and all the other positions are wrong. I mean, in the contrast, I could think, well, the person may be able to integrate. Or maybe he'll present different perspectives, try to integrate them together. And so it turns out, when you ask people to explain the issue to a 12-year-old, what happens is they're very much more likely to integrate. Much more so than, just try to teach them in a very didactic fashion, saying that this is the right way to do and this is the wrong way to do, and they forget about that other way because this is totally silly. So I think there's quite a bit of capacity again. That's what that demonstrates to me, is that there is a capacity. People are able to do it, providing the right context. Maybe not everybody. And, again, going back to the notion of ideals and beliefs, if you have some very strong religious beliefs and you're encountering a position that is completely different from what you endorse, you may not be able to. So I think there is sort of a gray area within which people sort of operate with respect to how much they can integrate. But anyways, what I'm trying to say is that to me it seems to be, again, more of a property of the situation, at least as much as a property of the person. It's common to various wisdom definitions. And I think it is really central to a successful human functioning.
So even people who may be very dogmatically attached to a particular ideological belief, you're saying, in certain contexts, will be able to put that aside and practically deal with it differently and communicate it differently.
Right. I mean, I think to an extent, I don't think it's all about the context. It certainly is also about how much and to what extent have you endorsed a particular set of belief systems. I'm just thinking about Palestine and Israel positions on land. And if you take extreme fundamentalists from each group, you will likely see very little integration. But again, maybe if you frame, and there is actually quite a bit of work on that, if you frame the situation in a particular way that would not touch on the, red buttons in their head about sort of, this is it, I cannot really integrate it at all. If you frame it in a slightly different way, they actually may be able to agree on some things that they would not otherwise. So even among the extremists.
Right. I mean, that's the kind of procedure adopted by mediation systems like nonviolent communication, for example. You come across that?
Yeah.
So presumably, would there be a practical application of your research that you envisage where to help people to identify these kinds of situations and kinds of focuses that would help them to integrate, particularly in positions of opposition like Israel Palestine?
Yeah, I mean, ideally that's where, if one is very naive, I would want to end up, and I am still quite naive and young in this regard, but of course, pragmatic considerations. And I'm a bit wary of, you have sort of an idea that you bottled in the lab where you sort of kind of confident in the set of findings, but you still don't know how exactly it unfolds in the real world. Yeah. So I think we need a bit more in terms of field experiments in the real world, a few more extra steps on the way to the actual practical application. I think it's quite dangerous to just take a concept and right away try to apply it, because if you don't know the full scope of how it unfolds, it may even backfire. So I would be a little bit more cautious there. But yeah, naively, of course, I would hope that at least some of this work can benefit the humanity can help to address some of the issues, societal or interpersonal.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the interesting things for me, or potentials from your work, is that, I mean, I've been talking for a little while about these kinds of features, as things like the role of provisionality and agnosticism and integration. But sometimes I'm asked, well, what's the evidence that these things are right?
Right.
I mean, I think evidence doesn't necessarily sway. It's not what's necessarily always what's important for people. But obviously, there are some occasions when it is, and when it could have a practical effect in helping to persuade people that these things are important. They're the way to go in resolving these massive issues, political issues, social issues, psychological issues in human life.
Yeah, and I think now there is some work both in North America and in Europe where different social scientists are also taking on these complex questions and this type of ideas that until recently were probably considered to be too esoteric to be studied in the lab. And so there is quite a bit of work emerging on intellectual humility. There is work emerging on sort of a discussion of extremism in political discourse and humility. Work on integration. There are different places in Europe that start to study wisdom. And I think sort of together maybe we can, in a decade or so, build a better understanding along the lines of what both middle way society as well as my lab studying wisdom are interested in.
Okay. I mean, another connection I'm interested in asking you about is whether you're familiar with the work of Ian McGilchrist on brain hemispheres.
No, please tell me more.
Okay. I mean, presumably you do know something about the functions of brain hemispheres, do you? And
of course.
Of course, yeah. So, I mean, do you see a role in what you're talking about for the differentiation or appreciation of the different functions of the left and right hemisphere, particularly the prefrontal lobes of each? So, I mean, Ian McGilchrist has some very interesting cross-disciplinary work in his book, The Master and His Emissary, which basically, for me, points out the massive moral and cultural effects of the different brain hemispheres, and particularly an overemphasis on an over-dominant left hemisphere. I mean, you have to be pretty careful with the language, obviously. I mean, it's easy to someone not familiar with his work to jump to the conclusion that he's oversimplifying, because I know how complex this area is. But you have to read his book and look at the references, basically. But there is a very sophisticated account of the hemispheres there, which nevertheless is prepared to offer a positive account of how we can use the hemisphere division to help with our understanding of, well, a whole load of things, really.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the work on neuroscience and particularly brain neuroscience may be quite useful to advance the understanding of some of these aspects of judgment, reasoning. I don't necessarily think that, as you already sort of alluded to, that we need to look at, hemispheric relationship to different components. There is quite a bit of work on, neuroplasticity, the things that are often attributed to one part of the brain can, under some circumstances, also be adapted to another part of the brain to an extent. So even though, hippocampus is a particular function and prefrontal cortex may have a different function in general, there is still quite a bit of plasticity, certainly in the neocortex. But I think overall, probably one of the next phases, fascinating phases in the research, for instance, on wisdom and this type of forms of reasoning that both you and I are interested in, and the philosophical and empirical angles, could be the intersection between neurophysiology and the way how people think. Now, personally, I find some of the insights that have been produced so far by the neuroscientific research community a little bit silly. Let me put it this way. And the reason is that, like, if you think about wisdom as a highly social contextual process, and these things seem to be unfolded in the context, and then I think, like, well, how does it work when you're put in a tube where you have like 20 centimeters to breathe, and you're sitting there non-moving for half an hour with a huge humming sound going like boom, 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 which is what, MRI scanner is like when you do studies in MRI scanner to identify the bolt signal in the brain when you study various forms of judgment tasks and so on. So for me, it's a very asocial environment. It's also a very weird environment. I don't think I encountered this type of environment in everyday life. And I'm lying on the couch, I don't have the same feeling when I close my eyes than when I lay in the scanner. So I'm a little bit skeptical of those approaches. I think maybe the next stage where we can move beyond this type of huge MRI scanners to study high-resolution brain process, we can get better insights. So more ecologically valid approaches seem reasonable. Right. But this caveat aside, I am also quite fascinated at the intersection of neurophysiology. Does not necessarily have to be, a cortical neurophysiology. It could also be physiology of the autonomic nervous system. I think that also can provide quite a bit of insight and aspects of reasoning and judgment.
I mean, the fascinating thing about the Gilchrist perspective, I think, is it's a way in. It's a way of modelling what we were talking about earlier. So the rigidity as opposed to the wisdom and provisionality.
I see.
You could model rigidity as over dominance, particularly of the linguistic and goal centres of the left prefrontal cortex. So that if we have this tendency for that particular part of the brain to be dominant with a representational model of what is the case of what we ought to be doing and what is the truth or what is falsity. And when we get stuck, it seems that we get stuck in that way. We get stuck in a way that involves a particular account or set of beliefs about what is true or false, due to a lack of openness, which would be more associated with the right hemisphere, to what's coming through the senses, what's coming from our bodies, further information that might change our point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably need to read more of this book to understand and fully appreciate the details, because as you said, it's like from the start, it's sort of like, well, there is somebody trying to put sort of one type of reasoning in one side of the brain, another type of reasoning, another type of reasoning. That seems too simple. But I cannot really comment on it right now because I just need more information about it.
Sure, of course, you'd have to read his book. But I mean, the thing to stress is that it is about specialization and dominance rather than just saying the left does this and the right does that.
Right. Yeah, I got that sense already. Yeah, so it's a bit more fine-grained than just simple exactly. Left, right. Yeah. Good.
Yeah. And of course, there were popularizations like, sort of left hemisphere types and right hemisphere types, which are pretty ridiculous. But,
so just like a little bit more careful nowadays, because there are a lot of popular science books that try to portray and simplify some of the more complex constructs. And I think brain is probably one of the most complex constructs and systems there is known to mankind. And so when people then reduce it to left and right, I have an uneasy feeling when I read that. But so this seems a bit more complex than that. Good.
Yeah.
So I have a question. So Robert, from the perspective of the middle way society, from your perspective, what do you think could be the next most interesting questions to examine, for instance, empirically?
Well, I'd be very interested to see empirical evidence, if it exists or can be developed, for how integration helps us. Maybe this exists already, but I haven't seen it. And particularly also how the avoidance of dogmatic beliefs helps us. So what the effects of that are. I mean, in many ways, it seems obvious. You just have to look at the world. You have to look at Israel and Palestine, for example. And there's so many things that seem obvious or common sense, but people don't tend to understand things in that way. They don't tend to recognise that dogmatic beliefs or rigidity or absolutisation are responsible for the particular problems that they have. So probably more precise evidence, if you were able to come up with it, might be extremely useful for people generally, I think.
Good.
Yeah, okay, well, absolutely fantastic talk, guys. Thank you very much for giving up your time, Igor and Robert.
You're more than welcome.
Well, thank you for the interesting insights, Igor.
Yeah, wonderful meeting you, Robert, as well.
Right. Okay, great.
Yep.
You can find out more about middle way philosophy at www.middlewaysociety.org.